It was supposed to be just another business trip, another month of airports, client meetings, and hotel rooms. But what the cybersecurity consultant never expected was that his own house, the very place he considered a private sanctuary, would become the stage for one of the most audacious betrayals his quiet suburban neighborhood had ever seen. Imagine returning home early, suitcase still in hand, only to find strangers living comfortably inside your own walls. Not burglars in the night, not squatters sneaking in through windows, but the very president of your homeowners association. A woman who was meant to safeguard the integrity of the community, hosting dinner parties, lounging on your couch, and treating your property as if it were her own. This is not fiction. This is the true story of how power, arrogance, and entitlement collided head-on with patience, digital evidence, and the cold precision of strategy. And it all began the moment he set foot back on his porch, weeks earlier than expected. The consultant had left for Europe with his usual routine, double-checking his smart home security system, syncing alerts to his phone, and locking every door. He knew his HOA president, Barbara, had always been overbearing. She prided herself on knowing every resident's business and enforcing rules with the smug certainty of someone who believed she was untouchable. Still, he never thought she would dare cross the boundary of his front door. He underestimated just how far her sense of authority stretched. Started small. A motion sensor pinged his phone while he was still abroad. The first alert seemed harmless enough, a false trigger, he assumed. But then came another and another. At first, he dismissed them as glitches. After all, technology, no matter how sophisticated, was never perfect. Yet the system was designed by him, installed by him, and audited with the meticulous eye of a professional who made his living in digital forensics. He knew its reliability was far beyond standard setups. Something was wrong. Curiosity became suspicion, and suspicion turned to certainty when his security camera captured a figure moving across his living room. The image was crystal clear. It was Barbara, the HOA president herself, brazenly stepping into his home with the confidence of someone who believed no one was watching. Not only was she inside, but she carried grocery bags, setting them on his counter as if she had just returned from shopping for her new residence. She wasn't breaking in. She was using a key, one she should never have had access to, except through a controversial bylaw she had pushed into existence. The so-called emergency access key policy. The footage was damning, but the consultant didn't panic. He didn't call the police. He didn't even confront her. Instead, he began to watch, to collect, to build. Every night after his work abroad, he would log into his home system, comb through the recordings, analyze the thermostat logs, note the power consumption. It became a second job, documenting, timestamping, and compiling a mountain of evidence. What he uncovered was staggering. Barbara had not only moved herself in but had brought her husband along. Together, they had turned his home into their private retreat. His expensive liquor bottles were opened and half empty. His refrigerator was restocked with food that wasn't his. The living room hosted gatherings, neighbors and friends of Barbara laughing and clinking glasses while the walls of his own house echoed with the sounds of parties he had never agreed to. The consultant's meticulous nature became his weapon. Every thermostat adjustment, every light switch flipped, every door opened was logged in his system. Audio recordings picked up conversations that revealed Barbara's intentions. She bragged to her husband about how no one would ever question her, how her position on the HOA board gave her all the leverage she needed. She mocked the very idea that the homeowner could challenge her authority. But she was wrong. He was watching. He was listening. And he was building a case stronger than any denial she could muster. Instead of cutting his trip short immediately, he extended his patience. He let her pile up mistake after mistake, capturing more and more evidence of her unlawful occupancy. For weeks, he collected it all: high-definition video, crystal-clear audio, precise data logs. Piece by piece, he was constructing a story no one could refute, not even Barbara with her air of authority. Then, with his lawyer's guidance, he quietly rescheduled his return flight. Barbara thought she had nearly 2 more weeks before he would be back. But the consultant had other plans. His arrival would not be silent. It would be orchestrated, calculated, and undeniable. As his plane touched down, he knew the stage was set. He wasn't just coming home. He was about to expose the abuse of power that had rotted at the heart of his neighborhood for far too long. And when he stepped onto his porch, suitcase in hand, he knew every camera in his home had already written the story for him. The door was locked, but the key he carried was the rightful one. And behind it, his house was no longer empty. It was occupied. The confrontation was inevitable. But instead of anger, what he carried with him was certainty. Certainty that every second of Barbara's betrayal had been captured, recorded, and preserved. Certainty that her downfall was only moments away. And as he turned the key, ready to walk into the chaos of his stolen home, the story was only just beginning. The moment the consultant stepped through his front door, the first thing that struck him was the smell. It wasn't the familiar, clean scent of his own home, but the lingering aroma of cooked meals, perfume, and wine. Felt lived in but not by him. The air carried the weight of someone else's presence, and every detail confirmed what he had already seen from thousands of miles away on his security feed. His sanctuary had been claimed, transformed into something foreign. The foyer table bore scattered mail that wasn't his. A pair of shoes, far too large and clunky to belong to him, sat neatly by the mat. A woman's handbag lay draped across the armchair he had purchased years ago, back when he'd first decorated the space. The sight of his belongings reduced to background props in someone else's life sent a wave of cold anger through him, but he remained composed. He knew every object out of place was more evidence of their violation. From the living room came muffled voices, laughter, and the clink of glasses. He didn't have to guess who it was. Barbara and her husband were there, comfortable, confident, certain that they were untouchable. His lawyer, waiting just outside with a folder full of data, reminded him of the plan. Patience, precision, exposure. They would let the truth unravel on its own, not through shouts or accusations, but through undeniable proof and legal force. Still, standing inside his own home while strangers enjoyed it was surreal. The consultant walked through his kitchen first. The counters were cluttered with groceries, half-used items, and a cutting board smeared with fresh vegetable scraps. His refrigerator, once carefully organized, was crammed with food he had never bought. Wine bottles lined the counter, their corks discarded carelessly. Even his expensive coffee beans, imported from overseas, had been ground and brewed, their aroma still lingering faintly. Every corner whispered a story of entitlement. His privacy wasn't just violated. It had been mocked, paraded, and consumed. Yet rather than storm in, he quietly signaled his lawyer to step inside. The two men exchanged a silent understanding. This was no longer just about trespassing. This was about dismantling the illusion of authority Barbara had built piece by piece. The living room came into view. Barbara sat on his couch, sipping wine from his glassware, her legs crossed casually as though she owned the place. Her husband lounged nearby, flipping through channels on his television, a blanket, the consultant's blanket, draped over his legs. Neither of them noticed at first. They were too at ease, too immersed in the comfort of a stolen life. When they finally turned and saw him, their faces froze. The consultant didn't need to speak. His presence alone disrupted their facade. For Barbara, shock was quickly replaced by indignation. She puffed herself up, clinging to the authority of her title as HOA president, as if it could somehow justify what she had done. Her words spilled out fast and defensive, but the consultant barely registered them. He wasn't here to argue. He was here to finish what had already been set in motion. Outside, the lawyer dialed the local police, requesting their presence. Within minutes, flashing lights reflected off the consultant's windows, painting the walls with streaks of red and blue. The calm silence of the neighborhood gave way to the low hum of radios and the sound of officers approaching the door. Barbara's confidence wavered. She began to spin her version of events loudly, attempting to paint herself as the victim, the one who had discovered a so-called intruder in the home. But this was the very moment the consultant had prepared for. He opened the folder his lawyer carried and handed over neatly tabbed sections of evidence. Each piece was airtight. Video clips with timestamps showing Barbara unlocking his door, audio recordings of her admitting she had claimed the house, logs of power usage spikes during her occupancy, and even receipts for utilities paid by him that proved the house was never abandoned. The officers took it all in, scanning the documents and replaying short clips on a tablet provided by the lawyer. The evidence spoke louder than Barbara's frantic protests. Her husband shifted uncomfortably, realizing that the story they had told themselves, that this was temporary, that no one would notice, was unraveling with every passing second. The consultant remained silent. His silence was deliberate, a sharp contrast to Barbara's rising volume. He knew that, in moments like this, restraint was power. The officers didn't need to hear his outrage. They had the truth laid out clearly in front of them. Neighbors, drawn by the lights, began to gather outside. Curious faces peered from porches and windows, whispering among themselves. For years, many had endured Barbara's heavy-handed rule in the HOA, her constant monitoring, her endless complaints, her threats of fines. And now, here she was, exposed in front of everyone, her authority crumbling in real time. The officers, firm but calm, informed Barbara and her husband that they needed to step outside. What had once been her seat of control, the consultant's couch, was no longer hers to occupy. She resisted, insisting she had every right to be there. But the handcuffs that eventually clicked around her wrists told a different story. Her husband followed, escorted out under the gaze of the entire neighborhood. For the consultant, watching them let out was not a moment of triumph, but of closure. He had spent weeks collecting data, enduring the humiliation of seeing strangers inhabit his home, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Now the weight lifted. The evidence he had gathered had not only protected him but exposed the rot in the system Barbara had manipulated for so long. But even as she was led away, Barbara hurled one final declaration, her voice sharp with desperation. That this was not over, that her position on the HOA board gave her influence that reached further than his front door. It was an empty threat, but it carried a reminder. The battle wasn't finished yet. The arrest was only the beginning. As the police cars pulled away and the neighbors slowly retreated to their homes, the consultant stepped back inside his house. It was his again, though tainted by the weeks of intrusion. His lawyer placed the folder of evidence on the kitchen counter, already talking about the next steps. Pressing charges, repealing the bylaw, and dismantling the power structure that had allowed this abuse to happen in the first place. The consultant listened carefully, but his eyes drifted over the space that had been misused, violated, transformed. He knew that while Barbara was now in custody, her shadow still lingered over the neighborhood. And as he prepared for what came next, one truth was clear. The downfall of Barbara's reign had only just begun. The neighborhood was buzzing the morning after Barbara's arrest. What had once been whispered frustrations about her leadership now spilled into open conversations. Neighbors gathered on sidewalks and driveways, piecing together what they had seen the night before. The sight of their HOA president, once so commanding, so untouchable, being escorted into a police cruiser was an image that none of them could shake. For many, it felt like the breaking of a spell. For others, it sparked questions. How had she managed to believe she could get away with such audacity? But Barbara was not finished. Even behind the walls of a holding cell, her influence lingered. She wasted no time in reaching out to allies on the HOA board. From the very beginning, she tried to twist the narrative. She insisted that the consultant had abandoned his home, that as president, she had simply taken temporary stewardship over an empty property. She painted herself as the caretaker, the protector, the one who had ensured that no squatters or criminals could claim the house in his absence. To her allies, she portrayed herself as a victim of overreach, unfairly targeted for performing her duty. The consultant, however, knew this was coming. He understood that Barbara's greatest weapon was not her authority. It was her ability to manipulate perception. And so he prepared. He spent long hours combing through the terabytes of data his smart home system had collected. He built timelines, organizing video clips in chronological order, aligning them with audio logs and utility spikes. He created a day-by-day reconstruction of Barbara's occupancy. The first night she entered, the morning she brought in groceries, the parties that followed. Each moment was carefully cataloged, time-stamped, and verified. His lawyer encouraged him to think not just as a homeowner seeking justice, but as a forensic storyteller. In court, facts mattered, but so did clarity. Judges, juries, and officers needed to see a narrative unfold. A story so undeniable that Barbara's carefully crafted lies would collapse under its weight. And so, the consultant transformed his evidence into something more powerful than data alone. It became a narrative of invasion, entitlement, and betrayal, backed by the cold certainty of technology. Meanwhile, the HOA board called an emergency meeting. Some members still clung to Barbara's influence, unwilling to believe she had crossed such a blatant line. Others, emboldened by what they had seen, demanded her resignation. The room buzzed with tension as Barbara's allies tried to stall, claiming due process, insisting that the situation was under review. But outside the walls of that meeting, the community was already shifting. The neighbors, once fearful of Barbara's scrutiny, had tasted the possibility of freedom. They had seen that her power could be broken. The consultant stayed quiet, letting the board argue among themselves. He knew his role wasn't to win the room with words, but to prepare the storm of evidence that would silence every objection. Barbara, released on bail, returned to the neighborhood not with shame but with defiance. She walked the streets with her head held high, speaking loudly about how she had been framed, how the consultant was exaggerating, and how she would soon be exonerated. Her confidence was a mask, but one that fooled a few loyalists. They clung to the idea that Barbara, the woman who had enforced every HOA bylaw with iron precision, couldn't possibly have stooped to outright burglary. But the cracks were showing. Each day, more neighbors whispered about the footage they had heard rumors of. Word spread of the consultant's meticulous collection, audio of Barbara mocking homeowners, video of her hosting parties, even records of her using the thermostat to make the house more comfortable for her stay. These weren't the actions of a caretaker. They were the habits of someone who believed she had inherited ownership. The consultant, for his part, refused to be baited into public spats. While Barbara attempted to wage her war through gossip and board meetings, he worked quietly with his lawyer, refining the legal case. The felony burglary charge was strong, but Barbara's attempts to weaponize her HOA title meant they needed more than just the arrest. They needed a crushing blow that would dismantle not only her defense but the entire infrastructure she had built around herself. And that came in the form of the Emergency Access Bylaw. It had been Barbara's crowning achievement during her presidency, granting the HOA board keys to every home under the guise of community safety. Neighbors had grumbled but complied, trusting that the keys would only be used in true emergencies. Now, that very policy had become the weapon Barbara used to invade the consultant's home. By proving her abuse of the bylaw, the consultant wouldn't just protect himself. He would tear down the very foundation of her power. His lawyer drafted a motion to challenge the bylaw in court, using Barbara's case as the prime example of its dangers. The consultant provided the supporting evidence, showing that Barbara had not only used the key but had done so for personal gain, not community safety. In doing so, he forced the HOA board into an impossible position. They could either defend Barbara's actions and risk their own reputations, or they could distance themselves from her, repealing the bylaw to restore trust in the neighborhood. For Barbara, it was the beginning of the end. Yet, in her stubbornness, she escalated. At the next HOA meeting, she stormed in, proclaiming her innocence, accusing the consultant of being a manipulator, even hinting that his smart home system had been tampered with to frame her. She clung to the idea that noise and bravado could outmatch hard evidence. But what she didn't realize was that the consultant had already prepared the next move. He had arranged for his lawyer to unveil a preview of the evidence at the upcoming court hearing, a carefully constructed sequence of video and audio clips that would be impossible for her to dispute. In those clips, Barbara herself admitted, in her own words, that she was living in the house. She laughed about drinking his wine. She boasted about how no one could touch her. She even mocked the very neighbors she claimed to protect. The preview would not only destroy her defense, it would shift the entire community's perception. Barbara's image as a stern but capable leader would collapse into that of a liar, a thief, and a manipulator. And as the hearing approached, the consultant knew the tide was turning. The neighborhood was ready for change. The board was fracturing, and Barbara's mask was slipping. Still, he also knew one thing. People like Barbara rarely went down quietly. The courthouse buzzed with quiet anticipation the morning of the hearing. What had started as neighborhood gossip had grown into a full-blown spectacle, and even those who weren't directly involved in the case wanted to witness how it would unfold. For the consultant, it wasn't just a day of justice. It was the culmination of weeks of patience, surveillance, and strategy. Every detail he had gathered, every log, clip, and timestamp, would finally serve its purpose. Barbara arrived early, dressed sharply and projecting confidence. Her head held high as if she were still presiding over a neighborhood meeting rather than standing trial for burglary. Her husband lingered close behind, visibly less composed but still trying to mimic her bravado. She greeted acquaintances in the hallway, spinning her narrative with polished ease. She claimed she had only acted as a responsible HOA president, stepping in to manage a home that had been left empty for too long. She assured anyone who would listen that the charges were exaggerated, fueled by a vindictive homeowner who wanted to undermine her authority. But bravado alone could not erase digital evidence. Inside the courtroom, the consultant's lawyer laid out the foundation of the case with precision. He began not with accusations, but with data. Logs from the smart home system showing exactly when doors were unlocked, lights were turned on, and thermostats adjusted. He presented screenshots of activity timestamps, undeniable records that placed Barbara inside the house night after night. The judge listened attentively, flipping through the documents as they were submitted. Barbara's lawyer objected at times, calling the evidence circumstantial. But the sheer level of detail undermined every attempt to dismiss it. The consultant had recorded not just one incident, but a consistent pattern spanning weeks. Then came the videos. One by one, the screens lit up with high-definition footage captured by discrete cameras throughout the home. The first clip showed Barbara unlocking the door with her HOA-issued key. The timestamp aligned perfectly with the system log. The next displayed her carrying in grocery bags, placing them on the counter, and instructing her husband to unpack them. Another clip revealed a gathering in the living room, with Barbara and several guests sipping wine and laughing. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder with each clip. It was one thing to hear about trespassing. It was another to see it unfold in crisp detail. The consultant sat calmly, his eyes fixed on the screen, knowing that the images spoke louder than any words he could offer. Then came the audio. A recording played of Barbara bragging to her husband late one evening. Her voice, clear and unmistakable, echoed through the speakers. She laughed about how easy it had been to use the emergency key, mocked the consultant for trusting his precious gadgets, and even mentioned that no one in the neighborhood would dare challenge her authority. Her tone dripped with arrogance, each word cutting deeper into the narrative she had tried so hard to weave. By the time the recording ended, the weight in the room was palpable. Barbara's face flushed with anger, but the confidence she had worn so effortlessly that morning was slipping. Her lawyer scrambled to recover, suggesting the recordings could have been doctored, hinting at tampering. But the consultant was ready for this. His expertise in cybersecurity and forensics allowed him to authenticate every file. He presented digital certificates and metadata verification, proving the integrity of the recordings. He explained how each log was stored redundantly, how tampering would have left visible traces, and how the evidence chain was meticulously preserved. His explanation was not just persuasive, it was irrefutable. The judge leaned back, studying Barbara with a critical eye. Her protests grew weaker, her claims of innocence drowned beneath the mountain of facts arrayed against her. The courtroom no longer saw a capable HOA president. They saw entitlement exposed, arrogance caught on tape, authority abused beyond repair. Outside the walls of the courthouse, the story had already spread. Neighbors discussed every development, reliving the clips they had heard described, marveling at the level of detail the consultant had captured. For years, Barbara had ruled through intimidation and fear, wielding fines and warnings like weapons. Now, she was reduced to defending herself against the very people she had once silenced. The consultant, however, remained focused. He wasn't here for revenge. He was here for justice, and justice required patience until the very end. As the hearing closed for the day, the judge announced that Barbara would stand trial on felony burglary charges. The evidence was overwhelming, and the case was moving forward. Barbara, pale and stiff, was escorted out under the watch of curious onlookers. Her husband followed silently, his shoulders heavy with the weight of reality. For the consultant, the victory was measured not in Barbara's discomfort, but in what came next. His lawyer had already filed motions to challenge the HOA's emergency key bylaw, using Barbara's actions as the prime example of its dangers. The court had accepted the motion for review. That meant Barbara's downfall would not only be personal. It would dismantle the very system she had built to enforce her control. The bylaw that had given her access, the policy that had legitimized her intrusion, was now on the chopping block. Back in the neighborhood, the board members felt the pressure mounting. Residents demanded reform. Some wanted Barbara removed immediately, while others, nervous about the fallout, urged caution. But the tide was shifting too quickly to ignore. The consultant's evidence had become more than proof of a crime. It was a rallying cry for change. That night, as he sat in his home for the first time without fear of intrusion, the consultant allowed himself a quiet moment of reflection. The house still bore traces of Barbara's stay. Furniture shifted, glasses misplaced, the faint scent of perfume lingering in the air, but it was his again. Truly his. Yet he knew the battle was not completely over. Barbara was cornered, but people like her rarely surrendered quietly. She would fight, clawing for whatever influence she had left, trying to salvage her image. The consultant, however, had no intention of backing down. He had patience. He had evidence. And most importantly, he had the truth. The trial would soon strip away the last of Barbara's facade. And when it did, the neighborhood would never be the same again. The trial began under a wave of community attention unlike anything the neighborhood had ever experienced. What should have been a simple matter of law and order had transformed into a symbol of justice for dozens of families who had silently endured Barbara's reign as HOA president. For them, this case wasn't just about a house, it was about power, abuse, and whether one person could twist community rules into personal privileges. Barbara entered the courtroom with the same rigid posture as before, but gone was the easy smile. Her clothes were immaculate, her hair carefully styled, yet her expression betrayed the weight of reality pressing in on her. She could no longer claim misunderstanding or exaggeration. The evidence was far too overwhelming. Instead, she would have to fight on technicalities, on the hope that her carefully chosen words might bend the narrative back in her favor. Her defense hinged on one central argument, that the emergency key bylaw of the HOA granted her access to the consultant's home. She claimed she was not an intruder, but a steward protecting property under the broad umbrella of her authority. Her lawyer emphasized this repeatedly, framing her entry as a misinterpretation of poorly written rules rather than a malicious act. But the prosecution was prepared. They called the consultant to the stand, not to recount his feelings or assumptions, but to lay out the facts. He explained step by step how his smart home system functioned. He described the redundancy of data storage, the chain of authentication, and the unbroken timeline that linked Barbara to every moment inside his home. The courtroom listened as he explained how his system recorded not only visual and audio clips, but also metadata, temperature changes, device activations, internet bandwidth spikes during her streaming sessions. It painted a picture of occupancy so complete that denial became absurd. The jury was shown images of Barbara sitting comfortably on his sofa, sipping from glasses that belonged to him. They were shown the logs of thermostat adjustments at 11:37 p.m., 2:04 a.m., and 6:29 a.m., all while he was thousands of miles overseas. They listened to her own words, recorded in the privacy of the home she did not own, mocking the man whose trust she had violated. The weight of evidence crushed every attempt at misdirection. Still, Barbara tried one last maneuver. She took the stand, her voice controlled but tinged with desperation. She spoke of her years of service to the HOA, her tireless work to maintain property values, her sacrifices for the greater good. She described the consultant as an absentee homeowner, someone who left his property vulnerable. She insisted she had merely maintained the space to prevent it from becoming a liability to the community. It was a performance meant to reframe her actions as selfless. Yet, under cross-examination, the cracks widened. When asked why maintenance required throwing parties, why she and her husband had been captured wearing the homeowner's clothes, or why groceries were stocked in his refrigerator at his expense, her answers faltered. She stammered, claimed coincidence, or brushed them aside. But the jury could see it. This was not stewardship. This was possession. The final blow came when the prosecution introduced her recorded remark about no one in the neighborhood daring to challenge her. It wasn't the words alone. It was the tone. Entitlement, confidence, arrogance. It exposed her true mindset, and the jury's expressions hardened as the audio echoed through the courtroom. By the time closing arguments were made, the outcome was nearly certain. The prosecution framed the case not just as burglary, but as a betrayal of trust, of neighbor against neighbor, of leader against community. The defense, left with no strong counter, could only plead for leniency, portraying Barbara as misguided rather than criminal. The verdict arrived swiftly, guilty on felony burglary charges. Barbara's composure cracked in that moment. For years she had controlled the narrative, silencing dissent, issuing fines, and instilling fear. Now, in front of the very people she had ruled over, she was stripped of her authority with a single word: guilty. Her husband, implicated but not charged to the same degree, looked hollow, his shoulders slumped in defeat. The sentencing was scheduled for a later date, but the damage was immediate. Barbara was removed as HOA president by unanimous board vote within 48 hours. The very neighbors she had once scolded for minor violations gathered signatures, held emergency meetings, and stripped away her last remnants of power. Meanwhile, the consultant's lawyer pushed forward with the motion to repeal the emergency key bylaw. The trial had given them the perfect stage. He argued that the bylaw had been written without safeguards, granting far too much unchecked power to individuals. He highlighted Barbara's abuse as the cautionary tale, a glaring example of why authority without oversight leads to disaster. The community rallied behind it. Homeowners who had once accepted the rule reluctantly now saw its danger with startling clarity. Stories poured out, board members entering homes to inspect landscaping, fines issued after supposed interior checks, whispers of favoritism and intimidation. Barbara's crime had torn the veil away, revealing the systemic rot beneath. Within weeks, the bylaw was repealed. The HOA instituted new checks, requiring community votes for any major changes and eliminating unilateral emergency access. New elections were held, and for the first time in years, neighbors felt like they had a voice. The consultant, though central to the transformation, did not campaign for power. He didn't seek a board seat or leadership role. His victory was already complete. His home was secure, his rights restored, and the system that enabled Barbara dismantled. He had proven that patience, evidence, and truth could outlast even the most domineering personality. Barbara, awaiting sentencing, faded from the spotlight she had once controlled. The gossip shifted from fear of her next demand to astonishment at her downfall. Residents shook their heads at the audacity of her choices, wondering how she could ever have believed her position gave her ownership over someone else's home. The consultant, in the quiet of his restored sanctuary, understood something deeper. Barbara's mistake had not just been entering his home. It had been underestimating him. She thought power was loud, immediate, and unquestioned. But true power, he knew, was patient. It was methodical. It was the kind that built a case piece by piece until there was no escape. And now, with her conviction secured and her influence dismantled, he had achieved not only personal justice but community renewal. Still, the story was not entirely finished. Sentencing loomed. The neighborhood, though transformed, awaited closure. Barbara's shadow, though smaller, lingered on the edges. And as that day approached, the consultant prepared himself for the final chapter. A moment not of revenge, but of resolution. The day of sentencing arrived with an air of inevitability. Weeks of trial coverage had already convinced the neighborhood that Barbara's fall from grace was permanent. But this final proceeding would stamp her fate in the language of the law. The courthouse lobby was crowded, not just with reporters and legal observers, but with neighbors who had quietly rearranged their schedules to witness the end of an era. For them, Barbara had not been merely a president of the HOA. She had been a looming figure in their daily lives. Her presence felt in every fine, every notice, every whispered threat of violations. When Barbara walked in, the transformation was unmistakable. Gone was the iron posture of authority. She looked smaller, diminished, her carefully constructed aura eroded by weeks of exposure. Her eyes scanned the room, landing briefly on familiar faces from her own community, only to find no support there. The whispers that followed her were not of respect, but of disbelief. Disbelief at how far she had fallen, and how unnecessary it had all been. The prosecution laid out its sentencing recommendation clearly. A term of probation combined with restitution, community service, and a felony record that would permanently strip Barbara of the ability to hold positions of trust or influence in the community. It was not prison that defined the punishment, but permanence. For a woman who had built her identity on power, reputation, and control, this was a sentence far harsher than confinement. Her lawyer pleaded for leniency, citing years of volunteer service, her age, and the absence of violent intent. But the judge, who had listened carefully to every word of testimony during trial, addressed Barbara directly. He acknowledged her contributions but underscored the gravity of her actions, the premeditation, the arrogance, the abuse of authority. He noted that leadership was never meant to be a license for intrusion, and that trust, once broken in this way, could not be easily restored. The sentence was read: felony burglary conviction upheld, 2 years of probation under strict conditions, 100 hours of community service, and a mandate to pay restitution covering the consultant's legal expenses and the damages from her unauthorized occupancy. Barbara's face crumpled as the words landed. The consultant, sitting silently in the gallery, did not gloat. He did not smile, nor did he allow himself the satisfaction of her visible defeat. His victory had come long before this moment, through patience, preparation, and truth. This, now, was simply the final note in a score that had been playing for months. Outside the courthouse, reporters crowded around, eager for statements. The consultant declined interviews, offering only a brief comment. Justice had been served, and the community could now move forward. It was, in his mind, the only message worth sharing. Back in the neighborhood, change was already unfolding. The new HOA board, comprised of residents who valued transparency and collaboration over control, had begun dismantling the culture of fear Barbara had cultivated. The emergency key bylaw, already repealed, was replaced with a system that emphasized homeowner consent and safety. Meetings that had once been tense affairs, dominated by Barbara's voice, were now open, collaborative, and even cordial. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact began chatting over fences again. Children played more freely on sidewalks without parents worrying about an HOA letter arriving in the mailbox the next morning. The community, once bound by silent resentment, was slowly rediscovering what it meant to live together in trust. For the consultant, the ordeal brought both closure and perspective. His house, once invaded, now felt more like a sanctuary than ever. Each room reminded him of what had been taken, but also of what had been defended. The quiet hum of his smart home system, once background noise, now carried a deeper meaning. It wasn't just technology. It was proof, protection, and peace of mind. In moments of reflection, he thought back to the choice he had made early on. Not to react in anger, not to rush into confrontation, but to gather, prepare, and plan. That decision had made all the difference. Had he called the police immediately from overseas, Barbara might have spun the narrative in her favor. Without evidence, he might have been painted as paranoid or even careless. Instead, he had allowed the truth to build layer by layer until it was undeniable. Barbara's downfall was not just the story of a single crime. It was the story of unchecked power meeting accountability. It revealed how authority, when left unchallenged, could distort into entitlement. And it showed that patience, combined with proof, could dismantle even the strongest facade. As weeks turned into months, Barbara's name faded from conversations. Her house, once a hub of whispered gossip, sat quietly on the corner, its blinds drawn. Some said she had moved away. Others claimed she remained, living quietly, stripped of the influence she once wielded. Either way, she was no longer a force in the community. She was a cautionary tale. The consultant, meanwhile, continued his work as a cybersecurity consultant, traveling abroad but always returning to the home he had defended. His story spread beyond the neighborhood, shared online as an example of patience, planning, and the unexpected ways technology could serve justice. For some, it was entertainment, a dramatic clash of homeowner and HOA president. For others, it was a lesson that in an age of digital proof, abuse of authority could no longer hide in shadows. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the neighborhood glowed in soft light, the consultant stood on his porch. He looked out across the street where families gathered, children laughed, and neighbors waved. The fear that had once hovered over this community had lifted, replaced with something simpler: belonging. He understood then that this story had never been only about him. His ordeal had sparked something larger. It had reminded his neighbors of their own rights, their own power to push back against overreach. It had shown them that authority was only as strong as the truth behind it, and when truth stood tall, false authority crumbled. The chapter was closed. The neighborhood was renewed. And for the consultant, there was no need for revenge, no desire for recognition. Justice had been enough. The story ended not with anger, but with restoration. A home reclaimed, community rebuilt, and a reminder that sometimes the greatest victories are not loud confrontations, but the quiet certainty that right, when patient and prepared, will always outlast wrong.